Welcome everyone to episode number 12 of the Intersection 4 podcast. You have your usual three hosts here. We have Hamis, the investor. We have Brendan, the founder and engineer. You have me, the product and philosophy guy. And today we have three topics for you. Three pretty exciting topics that we're seeing unfold right now. So, very recently, I think probably 2 weeks by the time that you're seeing this, the very long-awaited Bitcoin ETFs got finally approved by the SEC. There was a lot of fuzz around it in the crypto circles and in the broader economic circles. So we're gonna talk about that. We have also seen recent results on the Republican primary. So we're going to talk about the primary too, and we're going to talk about the World Economic Forum as well, and everything that's going on at Davos. So let's start with the ETF. For that, I'll pass it on to Hamiz. Do you want to give us a quick overview on what was the approval, how did that play out, and how did the markets react to the approval of the ETF?
Yeah. Just as background, exchange traded funds are just the newest innovation within the fund management business. They've been around quite a long time, but they are an extremely tax efficient, cost efficient way to get exposure to either a single asset or a basket of assets. And they've become the structure of choice. And whoever got the legal structure approved, deserves an award because they've structured the taxes in an interesting way. Wherein a traditional fund or a traditional like commingled structure, as you become an investor in that fund, all of the tax implications of the investments within the fund get passed on to you. But that's not how ETFs are structured. So what happens with an ETF is the ETF manager could be buying and selling those assets on a daily basis and actually throwing off like some tax implications, but they don't actually make it to the end investors until the investors themselves trade the fund. And so they're really tax efficient structure and have become the structure of choice for most investors. Now, the reason that they are difficult to approve and difficult to get past the SEC is because they have the same kind of regulatory and reporting requirements as a publicly listed company. And so, when a private fund, like a hedge fund or a venture capital fund is launched, it doesn't have nearly as many requirements because it only is offered to a very small group of people. It's not traded on a national exchange. It's only traded, between these private parties. But once a fund or a trust becomes a publicly traded fund, an ETF, then it has to have the same compliance as an Apple or a Microsoft does as a publicly listed company. So the SEC has to give it a stamp of approval, has to give it a green light. But historically, the SEC has this mandate to be merit neutral when it comes to approving different companies and products. What that essentially means is that the SEC can technically not have an opinion on the underlying asset that's being listed. So they cannot say, well, we actually don't like, silver as an asset class, and so we're going to stop this from getting listed. What they have to look at is silver passing the bar of what is necessary to be a publicly listed asset, and is the structure of the fund passing that bar? And if it is, somebody could create a fund out of Beanie Babies for all, the SEC cares. But they can't say, oh, we don't think Beanie Babies are a good investment, so we're not going to approve this fund. And that's
So let
where,
me
yeah, go ahead.
just to draw a little line there. For context, the Bitcoin ETFs, when I gave the introduction and I said the long-awaited Bitcoin ETFs are finally approved, I do mean long-awaited. It's been a decade. It's been a decade waiting for this approval. So a quick timeline of Um, did you guys lose me, or am I still here?
No, you're here.
Okay, okay. Sorry, I'll just say this again. We'll have to cut this later, but can you mark this, James, so that we can cut it later? Um, okay.
Got it.
So a quick timeline. I'll say that again. A quick timeline of the journey to get to this ETF. So Bitcoin was created in 2009. It was the first block was mined in 2009. In 2010, the first retail transactions appear with the famous 10,000 Bitcoin pizza from Papa John's. In 2013 is the first application
Mm-hmm.
for a spot Bitcoin ETF.
Mm-hmm.
Took 10 years and a little over for this approval to finally come. So to your point of merit neutral, James, there's been a lot of talk
Mm-hmm.
throughout the last few years that the SEC was basically cracking down on crypto. And we have actually spoken about this in the podcast before.
Mm-hmm.
What is your take here? Why do you think that it took so long? Do you think it was just like an orchestrated attack on crypto or an orchestrated resistance against crypto? Or was there something else at play here that people haven't seen?
Yeah, like I don't think the regulators are like that well coordinated. Like I think a lot of people would like to believe that, but the regulators are, jumping from crisis to crisis. I don't think there's like so much coordination behind the scenes on like what is supposed to happen, especially over like a 10-year period. There were different chairs of the SEC during that period. There were different chairs of the CFTC, which is the commodity trading regulator. I don't think there was like that much of a coordinated effort, but I do think that the underlying market was probably seen as just not mature enough, or just like too much of it was happening outside the US for their level of comfort. And what it actually took, what made this whole thing come through, it wouldn't have happened actually again this time around, was that one of the applicants for these ETFs that has been trying for a long time actually sued the SEC this last time around. And this applicant was Grayscale, which actually does run the largest um, Bitcoin ETF, and actually I think the oldest Bitcoin fund in the US. And they had some, 20, $30 billion in this fund. So it was, massive, massive vehicle. And it had been like really the only way for you to buy Bitcoin in your regular brokerage account before this. But the big difference between that fund and the new fund that just got approved was that that would trade in the over-the-counter markets, like the pink sheets. So some brokers wouldn't really cover it. There was also like a huge disparity between the value of the assets in the fund and the actual price of the fund. So sometimes it would trade at a premium, sometimes it would trade at a discount. There was like this whole issue because of that. So it wasn't a very efficient vehicle, but they still gathered about $30 billion in that fund. And so when they applied to get that fund converted into a proper ETF that trades on a national exchange, not the pink sheets essentially, um, the SEC rejected their application again. And this time around, they said, well, we're actually going to take this to the courts to figure out who's right and who's wrong. And the courts actually decided that in Grayscale's favor, that the SEC was not should reconsider their application, because in line with other applications that they've approved in the past, like this application meets the bar. And I know that there's like this whole concept in the crypto market that the SEC was purposefully trying to do this, but it actually is the job of the courts to decide these things for the SEC. So the SEC, when there's a disagreement between their interpretation of the law and the applicant's interpretation of the law, it's actually the court's job to figure out whose interpretation is correct. And it's a common thing that the SEC has to do and go through to get these types of answers and get them in a way that are then definitive moving forward. So they got that answer. So all the BlackRocks of the world and the Fidelities of the world owe it to Grayscale, which is this crypto startup essentially, for getting that win in the courts that then this time around the SEC could not reject it again because they were going to probably get sued by all the applicants, and probably the applicants would prevail.
So here are all of the tickers that we have for the Bitcoin ETFs that got approved. So we got 11 Bitcoin ETFs approved. Some with some pretty funny tickers. Shout out to HODL by Van Eck.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so we have and shout out also to Hashdex with an interesting ticker here with DeFi too. So it's really interesting to see that we got a wave of these products getting approved. But I wanna touch base on why this matters, right? So um a lot of people, especially people who weren't following this, were asking me like why would you have a spot Bitcoin ETF, or why would you have an ETF of Bitcoin when you can just go in and get the asset directly on Coinbase, right? So why does this matter, James? Like give us a bit of an explainer here.
Yeah, the only way for you to, get exposure over the last, since 2009 of Bitcoin being around is you had to find a place to buy the asset. You then had to find a place to store the asset. Then you had to find a way to report the taxes on the asset. And all the complications that come with owning this digital asset. Compare that experience to owning Apple, and it was just like a world of a difference in the experience, right? So the average, regular, everyday investor, the pension fund manager, the endowment fund manager, like they legitimately, I've had these discussions with people, would have, $100 million of Bitcoin on some USB drive that they couldn't find on their table when they were talking to me, right? So they're like, "Oh, you want to see my Bitcoin?" And they're like scuffling through the papers. Like, "Oh, here it is." And what they actually don't realize is that the Bitcoin isn't in the USB drive, right? It's just the seed phrase is in the USB drive, but that was legitimately how you held this asset, right? And when you hold it like that in that self-custodied fashion, you're actually not open to most of the retirement accounts and most of the tax advantage investors, like the tax exempt investors. You're actually not available to them in that format, because they usually have a very specific structure that they can invest in. So what this does is it makes the ownership of Apple and Bitcoin a similar level of complexity. That's essentially what it does. When you buy Apple stock, you never think about where the shares are going to be stored. You don't think about like where you're going to trade those shares. You don't think about the tax implications of buying those shares, right? You just get a statement at the end of the year, and it's like a very structured, understood process. And so it is, from one perspective, just going to make it 100x, 1000x, like more accessible and easier to hold the asset. But from another perspective, it's just a perception change where a lot of people, where the argument or the hesitation was that digital assets are going to get banned if they ever become significant, now have the largest capital market in the world and their most important regulator saying, like kind of hesitantly, they didn't want to do it, but they're saying, actually, you know what, this is a legit asset class, or at least like we can find a reason to reject it again. They
Yeah.
obviously don't want to say it's a legit asset class, but they haven't been able to find
So
another reason to reject it. Yeah.
this it's funny. This reminds me a bit of a scenario that I think happens in AI. We call it the messy middle, where the
Mhm.
point you said earlier, which was, why do we have to cram this into this ETF module when we have to figure out how to make it work with our taxes? Like the early versions of these digital assets to me felt like, oh, if you're on this digital asset, it solves all these paper and pen problems, the tracking, the reporting. But funny enough, we have to go through this messy middle of working across paper,
Mhm.
digital, digital ledgers. And it's actually a harder problem than just being paper, just being digital. In
Mhm.
the kind of the synonymous scenario that we think of in AI is with self-driving. Building a self-driving car is hard. But a harder problem is building a self-driving car that drives next to humans. So it's actually a similarly hard problem, which we're currently entering on both fronts. And maybe the outset is actually simpler than either.
Mm-hmm.
Really wanna stress that point. I miss that it's all about access, right? There is one of the best examples that I give people as to why this really mattered is think about the amount of money that is locked into pension funds in the US. There's trillions of dollars is locked into pension funds in several retirement accounts and several vehicles of savings for retirement. All that money was locked away, impossible to get exposed to Bitcoin, which is the best performing asset over the last decade by far. All that money was locked away, impossible to get exposed to Bitcoin, just because there was no vehicle that could be compliant and simple enough to be used in a pension fund, for example. So one of the main things that a lot of people were hoping and expecting, which is not necessarily playing out just yet, but a lot of people were saying, oh, with the ETF, we're going to open the floodgates to a massive amount of capital coming into crypto. This is not necessarily happening yet, but the thesis is there and the logic for this to actually happening is there.
Mm-hmm.
Now the question is,
and it's the same. It's actually very, very similar to how gold was, right? All these pension funds couldn't hold gold, especially not in the billions of dollars that they needed to hold gold, right? Like, what are they supposed to do? Like, open a vault the same way that somebody had to write down their, their phrase in a USB device. Like, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to buy $100 million worth of gold and then hire a bunch of guards to protect it. You can't do that, and not do it at least in the billions of dollars, which these pensions needed to do. And that's why the GLD, the gold ETF, changed everything. Because now with the click of a button, you could get exposure to the gold without all the complexities that come with holding, trading, reporting taxes on gold. And so gold became this institutional asset class, not because suddenly the features of gold or the use case of gold changed. It became an institutional asset class because the accessibility to gold changed with a click of a button. And that's, the tens of billions of dollars of gold are exposed through that GLD ETF. And every time there's a war, people click a bunch of buttons and get exposure. And every time there's peace, they click a bunch of buttons and don't have exposure anymore. So they've synthesized gold into, a digital format using the ETF. The same thing's happening with Bitcoin now.
And in many ways too, and just to wrap this up, is validation too. Validation of the assets class, validation of the classification of Bitcoin as a commodity, and the fact that you have some of the biggest institutions in the world either building a fund itself or building exposure in this asset class says a lot for where crypto is going. The last question before we move on here: how do you think this is going to impact the markets, James? Because it's interesting that we haven't seen yet the inflow of capital that a lot of people were predicting. But I think it would be helpful to explain how an exchange traded product impacts the market of the underlying commodity, especially when trades on that underlying commodity is digital in the case of Bitcoin, right? So let's say you have an ETF, just to give an example, you have an ETF of gold. The fund itself needs to hold that gold somewhere, but it's a lot more cumbersome to move that gold from place to place than it is to move Bitcoin from place to place, right? So explain us how the dynamic works between the holdings of the underlying asset by the fund, and then how an inflow of capital into the fund reflects on the underlying asset itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting question on the dynamics. And so obviously, like a lot of people, they have short-term memories and they don't understand like that these very secular trends, they go on for decades. Like these trends don't play out over a couple of months or even a couple of years. You're either going to be right about Bitcoin being digital gold or you're not. But you're definitely not going to find out in 2 weeks, right? And so you have to do all of that homework, all of that convincing yourself, like upfront, and then you have to stick around to find out whether you were right or wrong. To it's too early to call what's going to happen. I actually will argue that it's actually already showing incredible amounts of success, like probably as much success as I thought it was going to have. Bitcoin ETFs now are the second largest commodity ETFs in the country, right after gold. They're bigger than silver now as a commodity ETF. That happened in 3 days or 4 days of trading, essentially. We brought in about $2 billion net of new inflows, which is an incredible amount of money, especially when you take into account how few Bitcoin are available in the market and become available on a daily basis. So what you probably did in 4 days is you locked up about 50 days or 60 days of all the Bitcoin that are going to be produced. In those 60 days, you lock those up in 4 days in these ETFs, right? So the demand and supply dynamics are like pretty much bigger than people realize what's happening. It takes time for these things to settle in and get figured out. But essentially, the way that ETFs impact the underlying market is if somebody buys a share of the ETF. In this case, it's a simple example. It's a single asset. There are these participants, market participants, who are responsible for creating and redeeming shares of the ETF. In this case, actually, one of the participants is JP Morgan. So what would happen is, as you buy into that ETF, the participant would get an order, and that order would say, "Hey, somebody just bought enough of the ETF that we should buy one more Bitcoin." Or somebody sold enough of the ETF that we should sell one more Bitcoin. And then these participants, what they're responsible for is they're responsible for actually going and buying the asset in the underlying market and matching it to what the fund is supposed to be holding at that point in time, or sell the asset and kind of keep everything in line. So they're the ones that are responsible for creating and redeeming the shares of the ETF on a regular basis. And then once that share is created, then when you buy and sell something on your Robinhood account, you're not creating or redeeming shares. You're just trading between Brendan and Sam. So then there is like no impact on the price of Bitcoin. But when that initial share is created, or when that initial share is redeemed, that's when you have the impact on the underlying asset. So that creation and redemption mechanism is called the primary market, which is where shares are created and redeemed. And then the trading between Sam and Hamis and Brendan, that's called the secondary market. And that's when we're just trading the shares between each other.
Would you guys expect that this creates more or less volatility in the underlying asset?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the short run, as we're seeing very clearly, it will have higher volatility. But in the long run, this will be one of those turning points where the asset class becomes much less volatile than it was before, because you just went from being like a small boat in like this huge ocean to being like a oil tanker in this huge ocean, right? So obviously you're like way bigger, way more people coming on and off the boat, and so everything stabilizes when that happens. When you're just a small boat and a bunch of people jump in or a bunch of people jump off, like it really affects like how stable you are. But when you become an oil tanker, it doesn't affect you as much, the volatility.
That makes sense. Like just like the law of large numbers would like expect it to have lower variance. Does something around the actual mechanism change the volatility? Like the way that you were able to place orders, buys, and sells were like so cumbersome that it actually created less volatility, and that maybe these ETF markets, I don't know the answer, I'm not truly asking, like allow for more volatility given we've built high frequency trading infrastructure around ETFs that like now get unlocked too?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I don't have the exact like answer for it, but what I think is unique about this asset class is that usually the underlying asset doesn't trade 24/7. It actually trades in the same hours as the ETF or the fund does. But in this case, like digital assets have traded 24/7 since the beginning. But the ETF
And
redemption and creation mechanism only happens between market hours. So it's almost like what Bitcoin has been used in the past for, which I think it will increasingly be used for, was sort of like a overnight like macro trade. So if there was a war that broke out on Saturday, people couldn't trade anything else, but they could trade Bitcoin before the open on Monday, right? So you could kind of like front run these like macroeconomic, things that happen because the rest of the markets were closed. And
That's
so I think
interesting.
it'll increasingly be used for that. And I think some of the biggest buyers and sellers of this ETF are going to be the big macro funds, because they're going to find a way to express like their macro thesis, but over the weekend after 3:30 Eastern, right? Like they'll be able to, express their opinion like on a 24/7 basis.
okay, quick question then here. Do you think we see in the next 6 months the combined volume of all ETFs surpassing the Bitcoin volume on Coinbase and Binance, or no?
I'm not sure about Binance, but okay, so the weird thing about I would say yes to Coinbase. But the problem is
No,
all of
combined.
not combined. No, no. But what I'm saying is Coinbase. I think it can totally overtake. But the problem is that most of these ETFs are traded on Coinbase, and so it's kind of like they're creating the volume on Coinbase. But if you take out the volume of ETFs from Coinbase, I think you totally will have a larger market in the ETFs than you do on Coinbase. To surpass the volume, international volume, I think that's going to be challenging. I think there's so many investors all around the world that don't trade in the US markets, but when the digital asset markets opened, they kind of opened up to a lot more people than the traditional markets are open to. Just
I
because
think
of the
that's
nature of the asset class, it's just like people that never had access or interest or to investments like this that trade on a daily basis, like suddenly had access to it, and that really changed the dynamic. So I don't know if like the Chinese trader that trades like digital assets, you're going to be able to like overtake all of that volume all around the world with the ETF in the US. I don't personally see that happening.
I think that would be the turning point. I would assume that that's the turning point. If we see that, then like a lot of different dynamics begin to take place. But okay, let's just put a pin on this. Let's move on to the next topic here, which is the Republican primary. So we had the Iowa caucus happening on Monday, January, not June. We had the Iowa caucus, which is always the first primary in both the Republican and Democratic Party, taking place on January the 16th, where Trump won by 51% or so. Second came DeSantis, after that Nikki Haley, and then Vivek. And then right after the results came out, Vivek took to Twitter and said the entire campaign is about speaking truth. We did not achieve our goal tonight, and we need an American first patriot in the White House. The people spoke loud and clear about who they want. Tonight, I am suspending my campaign and endorsing Donald J. Trump, and will do everything I can to make sure he is the next U.S. president. I'm enormously proud of this team, this movement, and our country. So Vivek, who was actually the champion of crypto, one of the most liked candidates by libertarians, including yours truly, dropped out of the campaign and ended up endorsing Donald Trump. And we will have New Hampshire happening next Tuesday. And the New Hampshire primary, a lot of people are saying, is going to decide whether Nikki Haley still has a fighting chance or even DeSantis has a fighting chance. A lot of people, and even the polls, are saying very unlikely. It seems like Trump is just going to win the primary in New Hampshire and is going to cement the deal that Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. I'm going to pause there when I hear you guys' thoughts. Let's begin with you, Brendan. What do you think of this primary dynamic? Who do you think is going to be the nominee? And what's your personal outlook on that?
I think it's pretty clear that in my opinion at least, Trump is going to be the nominee. What I think Vivek's done, and I think he probably knew this from the start, is he's laid some pretty impressive groundwork in that camp that I don't think a lot of folks have really seen make it that far. Will we have a two-party system for the next election? Probably. The one after that, most likely. The one after that, maybe not. And I think this is the early signal of maybe changing tides. So it was an interesting run. I thought a lot of his opinions were very fresh, but yeah, realistically, I think I'm taking Trump.
Yeah, because the margin that he won by apparently was the biggest since forever. So it's pretty decisive. I think pretty decisive that unless there's some disqualification, it's going to be him. And I think this happens every time. Every time Trump wins, it's people overestimate how much people care about all these lawsuits and all these allegations, and underestimate how a big part of this country feels about how well their life is going, right? And it's you can be you completely disagree, but and I'm not even an American. I don't have a chicken in this race. But you can completely disagree. But the thing that makes America different is that you can still say, yeah, you can have a different opinion, but I'm not smarter, better, or kinder, or more. I love my country more than you. It's that's what makes America different, right? And so
let me just make a quick comment there, Hamis. That you said that you're not being an American, you have a chicken on this race. I'm also not an American, but one of the things that I realized very early on is that literally every person on this planet, because of the position of the United States, has a chicken on the race of who becomes the president of the United States, and by consequence, the most important person in the world, right? So I definitely think that it's important to at least contribute to the discourse in a meaningful way, although you don't vote. I think it's very important to contribute to the discourse in a way that actually helps advance the discussion forward and help the people who are actually doing the voting choose a candidate that's going to be good, both for the country, especially if you love the country like I do, and also for the world. So just wanted to make that little comment.
No. I completely agree, and that's what I was trying to get at, is that the thing that makes it different and special is that you can disagree, but you still give them the respect that any democratic process needs, right? And it was Jamie Dimon at Davos, really upset in one of his interviews, where he's talking about, hey, there's a whole other part of this country, and we can't just dismiss them by saying, oh, they're probably not that smart, they're probably not that educated, or whatever the going talking point is. They have an opinion, and you have to empathize with that opinion, which is not what they're thinking, but why they're thinking it. And the more that you have these surprises where Trump has all these things going against him, but he still wins by the biggest margin, that should make you empathize even deeper, because you should be hey, the problem must be so deep that people have to look past all these other things, and still back somebody, because they agree, or at least can resonate with what this person is saying and what he stands for, right? So that's how I see it, at least, as an outsider.
Yeah. So I wanna expand on that, actually, because that's a really good point. When Trump won in 2016, I was watching this from Colombia a few months, actually, a few weeks before I came to the US to come do my college here. And I remember watching, completely baffled, that Trump had won. I think nobody expected it. Everybody was like, whoa, unbelievable. And I saw a video from a UK political commentator. I can't remember who this was. I can't find the video for the love of me. But the video was basically a wake-up call to the Democratic Party, basically saying, what the fuck were you doing putting Hillary as a nominee? And the exact same thing is happening again this year. It's crazy that the Democratic Party hasn't even woken up. The Democratic Party won the 2020 election simply because people were freaking out with Trump. They haven't done anything in the last 8 years to advance their base, to advance their political candidates, to renew their presidential candidates. It continues to be the old guard. It continues to be the same established elite. And people, as you're saying, Hamis, are just fed up with this. They just don't want this anymore. They don't want to see this anymore. And I think I hope to a degree that the party is going to wake up after they win on a landslide in this election against Trump, if Trump turns out to be the nominee, because there's zero chance in the world, in my view, that Biden can beat Trump. So I definitely think that a lot of this has to do with the party just being completely asleep. But Brendan, to your points.
I'll give you a counterpoint from having a few friends in DC that were working for the Biden administration, Kamala Harris's campaign to be president prior to these sorts of situations. What you find though is, it probably on the outside looks like the DNC's asleep, but really it takes a person to spend political capital to say we're going to elect someone else. And if Biden's someone who's been in the administration for so long, that the amount of political capital he has and that he is embedded into his constituents within the Democratic Party, for someone to turn on him, that would take an immense amount of your livelihood, the amount of social will you've brought up, that even if everyone believes it, for someone to work outside of the realm of Biden and his people could just torpedo your career. So even if everyone knows it and maybe it seems like sleeping at the wheel, it's very hard to actually change what today is the current structure, because to move out of that structure, you have to be willing to risk a lot from their campaign.
100% agree. 100% agree. Yeah. And look at what happened with the up and coming Democratic candidate that we had at least last year, being RFK. He was literally ousted from the party. He was ousted from his political family. His brothers came up, his siblings came up saying he doesn't represent the values of the Kennedy family. He doesn't represent the values of the Democratic Party, just because he didn't want to support Biden. So yeah, I totally agree with your point. I think it's definitely political inertia. But frankly, it's tough because Biden, I think, represents the old guard. Biden represents the well-established Democratic political elite, and people are just tired of it. Left and right, people are tired of it and are trying to look elsewhere for alternatives. I have never identified as a conservative voter or even as a conservative-leaning political participant, but for the first time over the last year, I've been looking at Republican candidates and being like, oh, okay, this could be a good candidate. I think this could be a good person. And I was really, really excited about the possibilities of Vivek coming up, a young guy. Oh, you guys lost me?
No,
you guys, I thought you guys lost me in the call. No, okay. No. I mean, okay. I think
it's less of I think it's less of what each candidate stands for. It's more of who stands for the old and who stands for something different, right? Not even something new. Yeah. It's who stands for something just, for God's sakes, different, right? And I think that to be together with a bunch of young people, and that's why Brendan's first comment was so interesting. This next few elections, maybe there's a two-party, structure, but after that, maybe there's not, because I think people are tired of this current structure. They don't know the answer of what the solution is, but they're there has to be something different, because you're just pulled in these two buckets. And I'm coming from outside, where I see multi-party kind of elections, and I see that the losing parties have to kind of come together, create coalitions. That structure is a better structure, because you can be more nuanced in that structure. And you can at least feel when you're voting, it's not the better of the two evils, right? You can actually be nuanced in your decision making. And so I think a lot of people, it's less of they have the answer. It's more of they're we know this isn't the answer. And so anybody who's different from that is appealing to these people.
I would even make one more argument, which is majority of these people are talking about their ethics and morality in the philosophical lens, but it's coming from a place of their wallet. I think if you imagine, if you're not even in government, but if you're a high profile citizen that has built up their social capital understanding a certain methodology, and you have your best friend's an oil and gas tycoon person, and someone else is in coal, and your third friend who you grew up with is in fracking, and these were all non-issues back in the day. And then you can finally get to the place where you're going to run for office, or you know someone that is, and then all this environmental stuff comes out. Like, do you have the ability to kind of unwind all of that social capital and real capital to kind of mend what today would be unfathomable for these types of folks? So I think time is our biggest adversary here, or time is our biggest friend. So as people kind of graduate out of this process, we'll expect to see some actual change.
It takes a lot of personal, social, and professional capital to go against the grain of your clique. And to your point, yeah, Brendan, of you guys losing me, I was asking the same question to myself. I was like, whoa, have I spent so much time in crypto, and have I spent so much time surrounded by libertarians, and now I'm going to lean Republican? And I just reached the conclusion that, like, yeah, like if I go with my clique, 100% I would turn into a Republican, or I would turn into a libertarian type voter, or a libertarian type political mind. But it's really interesting that becoming a one issue voter is a luxury that a lot of people don't have. And that's clear all around the United States. And at least for me, again, I'm not a voter, but at least for me, in the way that I think through who I want to support with my ideas, it's just really hard. It's really hard for me to stand behind a lot of the things that Trump represents, right? That's why I was excited about Vivek, maybe somebody with more nuance and so on. But it's just tough for me to stand behind somebody like Trump and many of his ideas and representations. But the point being here that I think the country wants change, and they're looking at whoever can provide this change. Yeah,
I think the world wants change, and that's why you see, the Argentinian leader, which is a good segue into the next topic. Like, in the beginning, like when you first hear him, you're like, what is this guy talking about? This is like so different than what I imagine him being the topic of the discussion. But when you listen to him more and more, like all he's saying is essentially, hey, whatever we're doing is going to be different. Like it's going to be different than what you've seen before. And so it was an interesting speech for sure. Yeah.
Let me introduce this topic here real quick. So let's segue here into the next topic. So as many of you know, the Davos conference, the World Economic Forum conference at Davos is happening throughout this week and has been happening throughout this week. And you've had a lot of people go and talk at the conference. And there's been a lot of interesting, presentations at the conference, a lot of interesting speeches and so on from the world's elite, a lot of political leaders, a lot of business leaders and so on. One of the speeches that is going around social media right now and that went really viral was Javier Milei's speech. He is newly elected president of Argentina. And for those who are not aware with the context, Argentina has come out of a multi-year, very left-leaning government, and that has basically plunged the country, which was one of the wealthiest countries of South America several years back, has plunged the country into bankruptcy, frankly. So he's coming in bringing a lot of, frankly, just Republican or conservative or libertarian ideas. And his speech at the World Economic Forum, which, by the way, is being associated with the democratic or liberal progressive elite, he came in and basically said, hey, what the state is doing, what a lot of you guys are doing, condemning entrepreneurs, condemning or trying to contain economic development, all of this is wrong. We need to go back to the idea of free markets. We need to incentivize free markets and so on. So he came up to the World Economic Forum, which is a conference that is being associated with the typically liberal economic elite, and said, and this speech was basically was saying free markets work, state intervention is not a good thing. You guys are the trends that you leaders of the world have been pursuing lately are negative, of state intervention, of extensive welfare programs. We need to go back to free market capitalism. We need to incentivize more innovation, more entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth, right? So it was basically an attack on state intervention and a championing of free market capital. So I'll pause here. I want to hear your thoughts from the speech or from the ideas that he has represented in his speech.
Yeah, I'm a free markets guy through and through, so I love this stuff. And I think that government, you know, over the years, as you see like how regulators and governments act, like it's just like incremental like addition of control and oversight, and it's just like a never-ending thing. You'll never see, let's reduce the regulation here and replace it with new regulation. It's more, hey, we're going to keep doing that, and we're going to add more to it every couple of years when something goes wrong. And so what ends up happening is over, you know, 20, 30, 40 years, like you just over-regulate industries. And so I think the role of government has been really blown out of proportion. And I'm going to oversimplify it. Like it's not as simple to do this in real life, but government should only get involved if there's a serious likelihood of people getting hurt. But outside of that, both financially, physically, but as long as there's not a very serious chance that people are going to get hurt, government should step out of the way and let the free markets run the show. But it's kind of like, if you have a pulse, if you have anything going on, the government wants to regulate it, and that I think is the wrong approach and what they're trying to get at.
Brenda, what are your thoughts on this?
I'll comment on that in a second. It reminded what you just said. It reminded me of can't remember who said this, but effectively, businesses and governments are similar to an organism.
Okay.
Its sole purpose, in many ways, is to grow, and there's very few little mechanisms to actually constrain or make less policy laws from a lot of these organisms or organizations without like a large event happening, a predator, a larger organization, some sort of like large scale event. Maybe that happens here, maybe it doesn't, but if history were to repeat itself, I think everyone is going to continue to grow, either if you're a government or organization, until some larger factor comes through and kind of resets everything. Davos, I haven't spent enough time digging into Davos, but I think it's probably all the same. A lot of talk. We'll see what actually happens. I don't pay attention to Davos as much as most people probably.
So a thought here on Millet's speech. I actually disagree with a lot of the things that he says, and I really disagree with the discourse that's been going around in libertarian circles of free market capitalism is the only way forward and you need to completely stop state intervention. I made this tweet, and I've been literally spamming anyone who's been sharing this video. I've been spamming them with a retweet of this tweet, basically saying, this is a false economy. It's not an either or. And I read a lot, and I've spent the last several months reading a lot about history, particularly history of societies and history of money and history of states. And since the very beginning of society, the two things, or society as we understand it today, right? Like as market societies, the two things are intrinsically linked, and they're impossible to be separated. Some form of governance comes hand in hand with markets, and it's impossible to separate the two. And from the beginning of society, these two have been trying to strike balance, and the life that we live today is a consequence of this healthy balance between these two. And the false economy that is getting sold now is basically just pushing us to extremes, and either extreme just doesn't work. If you only have free market capital, you're going to have inequality, and you're going to have instability, and you're going to basically fracture a society from within. If you only have state control, you're going to have socialism, you're going to have capitalism, you're going to have poverty, and you're also going to break society from within. You need to find that balance, and I think rhetoric like the one that he was selling, or the one that a lot of libertarians are selling, is net negative, and I think more nuance needs to be applied to these discussions. Yes, free market capital works, but I think states, governments play a fundamental role in building incentives for that wealth to be distributed as equally as possible to all participants of a society to keep from to keep the society from actually rupturing from within from the inequality.
I disagree, but sure. Um, yeah, I think that those systems, I haven't studied any good examples of those systems. I'd love to have a more nuanced opinion, but generally speaking, most of the examples for that type of government intervention in distributing wealth have not gone well, from what I can tell. And so,
It's not a matter of like a proper system. It's just incentives in like taxes or welfare programs or public health care and just normal welfare programs that the government actually puts in place to try to make society more equal and give access to people to basic services. Or a different example too is just like straight up incentives, like economic incentives for certain areas that need to get developed. Like if you go back to, for example, the emergence of the chip industry in the United States, the chip industry wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the government actually being the first customer, providing a lot of incentives throughout the years to the industry, because the government deemed the industry to be of national priority. Another example is the internet. The internet wouldn't have happened without the government. Like these two things are intrinsically linked. It's impossible to
Those are
separate the
both
two. And I
debatable.
think, okay, go ahead. Do your counter
I,
argument
I,
there.
I'll give you the counter. The To say that they'd never be created, like we definitely debate that, because maybe it just happened 2 years later or 10 years later. But we've also not thought of the alternative, which is because of the taxes collected to support the current government spending, what could that have done in the pockets of the free market through private markets? Could we actually have like got the internet faster, done chips faster, innovated faster, solved for a lot of these like AI issues or climate change issues, because it hasn't had to go through a like bureaucratic system? I don't know if that's the answer, but that would be the counter of, a counterfactual world is one we've never lived in. We can only speculate on.
That's fair. That's fair. I think the problem here from first principles is that there's a built-in misguided assumption that free market capitalism is going to, in the short term, maximize for the benefit of everybody involved in that system, and that is just not true. I think free market capitalism over the long term, and when I mean long term, I mean decades, hundreds of years, is a rising tide that basically lifts all the boats. Everybody living today lives infinitely better than anybody who lived 200 years ago. There's no questions around that, and a lot of that has to do with just simply free market capital. But in the short term, free market capital is not optimizing for that. Free market capital is optimizing for the profit of individuals. And if you want to build some sort of a stability in the short term, which is our lifespans, single generations, a span of like, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years, you need programs, you need a state intervention, you need taxes, you need and the debate of where this line gets drawn is an ongoing debate that is going to keep going for so long as humanity organizes itself in societies. And I think it's a healthy debate. And I don't think it's good to throw the debate into either of extremes, because then you have people like Trump getting elected, or you have policies that actually are beneficial in many ways getting revoked just because people are poisoned with this idea that it needs to be an either or. It's not a false economy, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. Both work together, and you need to find the balance between the two. One can't exist without the other and has never existed without the other.
are there any good examples, Sam, of some country or society that have actually achieved that balance?
I think the United States, man. I think the United States is a government, is a central government which has a strong central government. I mean, if you read the Federalist Papers, and you understand the historical context when the Federalist Papers were getting developed, there was so much pushback, man, on the idea of the Confederation, simply because people were scared of the government being way too big. So it's interesting that the idea of a big government that is providing for the safety of its people, is providing for the military security, is providing for the sovereignty of its people, allows for a free market to actually emerge from within. So the United States, I think, is one of the best examples of a working balance between state government and free market capitals. Another example, maybe more leaning towards state intervention, is China. And then at that point, of course, you can say that like a lot of the fundamental liberties of individuals get sacrificed and so on. But I mean, from an economic standpoint, it's working really, really well. The state is directing where you invest and where you allocate your assets, and people are executing on it through free market capitalism. So I think this works, and it's been proven time and time again in history that the balance works. It's just a matter of finding the balance that aligns with the values of the people that the government is governing.
But don't you think the balance is falling out of place because you already have all of this government, its size, its influence, and there's never, I don't at least perceive it this way, there's never an industry or a time in my lifetime that I see government like replacing some of that influence with other influence. They just keep adding more. And so what might have started off as like the right system, and in the 50s and the 60s, you were at the right balance where government wasn't too big, but not too small, and you're like right there. But now everywhere I look, it's like, yeah, just add more agencies and add more regulation. It's never actually, well, there's no longer a need for this part of the government, so let's get rid of that. Like, when was the last time the US government got rid of an agency? Like, I don't know. Right. And so that's my challenge with it. Is like I actually agree with you.
Whenever their budgets shrink.
Yeah. When
Yeah.
did the deficit ever shrink? When did the debt ever shrink? It was so fascinating. I was watching like this TikTok the other day of a debate in like the 80s, and they were talking about like our national debt of a couple, $1 trillion as like the biggest problem in the entire world. And I'm like, guys, like if you knew what happened 30, 40 years from then, like your mind would be blown, and you'd be like, what is going on? And so that's my problem with it, is I actually agree with you. I think the US is one of those few countries that struck the right balance, but that balance started to tip the wrong way probably 40, 50 years ago. And we're going, I
I totally
think,
agree.
in the wrong
I
direction.
totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree. And actually, I want to share this too. So Snowden a couple of days ago made a tweet. He basically said, if I had to pick a time when the United States started to collapse in the century, I would point to three things: impoverishing the worker via union busting and offshoring, unleashing the state by abandoning the gold standard, and this continually raising essential liberties post 9/11. And one of the things that I've learned from reading history, and I mean, you observed this too during the COVID-19 pandemic in many countries, to a degree, including the US, is that a lot of powers that are granted during emergency times
Never
never
go
get
away.
revoked.
Hmm.
Look at 9/11, for example. Look at the entire theater show that we have been going through anytime that we fly in the US over the last 20 years. Those powers that were granted after 9/11 were never taken away, and so on and so on. You continue to erode individual liberties. So,
Yeah.
in a way, a state decays over time as it goes through more and more emergencies. Its government gets granted more and more power, and those powers never go away. So it goes back to the point that you guys were making earlier, that organisms grow, markets grow, governments grow as well. So I totally agree with that point. And maybe, just maybe, that also lines up with the ongoing cycle and an historical cycle of raising national powers and decaying national powers. One of those factors is the government just gets too big. There's just way too many bureaucrats. There's not enough innovation, and then the balance of a free market and a strong government falls apart because the government gets way too strong, overshadows the market, and then it's time for a refreshment in the way that the world organizes itself. Maybe I haven't seen examples, at least not that I'm aware of a country that has been able to course correct in terms of the growth of its government, and the action of its government overshadowing its market. But maybe it's possible. I just haven't seen it yet. But the point that I'm making is, it's not a false economy. It's not either or. Both need to work together. And I genuinely think that as harmful as big government is, completely ignoring big government is a recipe for an equal disaster on the other side. Basically, I agree that right now government is overstepping in many ways. If you look at the U.S. foreign debt, if you look at just like the almost weird brainwashy feeling of the media, the current status quo with politics in the United States and so on, you can feel that the government has grown bloated. But at the same time, I think that completely going the other way and building a rhetoric that says we need to completely get rid of all of these welfare programs, we need to completely get rid of any sort of state intervention is equally harmful. And I don't think it does good for anybody involved, because otherwise you just have inequality, instability, and eventually just like ruptures in the fabric of society of a given country. And by the way, inequality in the United States is an all-time high as well, right? So it's not like we're doing too well on that side either. So it's about the balancement, and selling a dichotomy is harmful for everybody involved in either side.
Yeah, this is one of those rare occasions where we have a political debate and we actually agree. So it's good.
Yeah, I agree.
Quick edit. End here quickly.
maybe we should end it on this note, but yeah. No, this is good. So, guys, I would say let's put a pin on this and wrap it up here. I think it's been a good episode, and let's end on a good note here of agreeing on something at the end of the pod. So, any final thoughts, any final remarks here about the economy, about the political landscape, and about the future of the US that you guys want to share? One final point that I would make here is that I think we reach an agreement at the end of the discussion because we were able to have a nuanced conversation. And that is absolutely impossible to do in a platform like Twitter. And I am also growing a little concerned that X, or Twitter, is clearly becoming the modern day town hall in which people are actually talking and discussing and sharing ideas. But it is the last platform that you would go to if you actually want to have a meaningful conversation. So the incentives in the platform like Twitter are, of course, leading you to create short form thoughts that are mimetic, that spread easily, that appeal to your feelings, and it's just completely eroding the quality of public debate. So I really appreciate a medium like this in which you can actually flesh out discussions and actually have meaningful conversations, which is tough to happen on a platform like Twitter. So if anything, I would say listen to the Intersection 4 podcast more and talk to your friends more. That's all that I would say. So
That's right.
Let's close with that. Guys, thank you so much, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.